So welcome everyone to this session about ethics for extended reality, for augmented reality. I am going to use the next 30 minutes or so to talk a little bit about the ethical part of extended reality, of augmented reality, and everything what's going to happen beyond the screen, I would say, right? So as a quick introduction, my name is Patricia Reiners. I'm an innovation designer based in Berlin, focusing especially on user experience design, UX for everything that happens beyond the screen, so AR, VR, and those kind of technologies. And I have been a creative resident at Adobe, so this talk is sponsored by Adobe, so thank you for that. And for everyone who's joining this talk, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Would be super nice to connect, to share maybe LinkedIn contacts, and to just say hi and connect with each other. So feel free to introduce yourself, share your contact details in the chat so you're able to connect. I won't be able to follow the chat during the talk, but I will definitely have a look afterwards. So if there are any discussions, feel free to just send them in the chat, and my colleague is happy to answer them. So before we are going to talk about the future of AR and all those immersive technologies, I want to have a quick look at where we are right now, right? Because at the moment we are in a super interesting time. So time has changed so much, especially for us working in tech, I would say. You know, from the start of the web, when designers worked on like simple websites or like movie websites, online shops, advertisement, we have been now designing like giant worldwide networks that really manage personal information and generate also sometimes abuse and harassment. And many of us are designing like smart devices that can listen and watch to the things we are doing in our home. And for us, designing and experiencing those products, it's super important that we are understanding that the whole system has become super complex. And I'm not only talking about like technically complex, but also ethically complex. So our field has matured and we need to mature along with it. And I think that's super important. So we are going to do a little field trip into the future in the next 30 minutes or so. And this is not a real talk, but also a discussion. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to share them in the chat. I think it would be super interesting for all of us to really share our own learnings, our own experiences. So if you're related to the field, feel free to share that in the chat so you all can connect and share insights there. So this talk will be about the future, so a little bit, some kind of a future vision. And when we are thinking about the future, we're getting from the now, where we are right now, to the future. And when you think about that, it might look like that it's some kind of a linear way from the point we are right now to the future. But that might be not really the case. And I had a look at the field of future studies. I think we can learn a lot from there. And the central principle there is actually called futuring, and they're seeing the future as plural. And I think that's a really good starting point here. I really like this quote from the famous robot ethicist and futurist Sarah Connor. She said that the future is not set here, there is no fate, but what we make ourselves. And I think that's a really good starting point before we are going to get a little bit deeper into the topic. So let's have a look about the future ring. What does it really mean? So the future maybe isn't like a mark on the map, but it's the map itself. So collectively, we can decide which coordinates we're going to head to. And a common and super interesting model, I think, in this area is the future studies seeing as some kind of a future cone, which uses the analogy of a light like a light shown from the torch. And the x-axis represents time. So the torchlight represents potential futures and the beam diverges from the present. So when we think about our next week, it's more or less predictable. So we probably already know what might happen, right? But there are also plausible futures, and these scenarios are a little bit less likely, but still foreseeable and super interesting, especially for corporates or for all of us. And there are also possible futures, and these futures are not so interesting for corporates or for us because they're more about like speculations and not so probable actually. So they're a little bit about like sci-fi. And where do we want to get? What kind of future do we want to have? We want to have the preferable future, and that's somewhere in the middle, always changing a little bit. And the preferable future is actually a super valuable judgment for us, where we consider the world we want to have and also how do we get there. And the question here is actually preferable to whom, right? So talking about preferable, but preferable to whom? And I think that's a good question here. And when we are thinking about preferable future, we can use that as an interesting prompt for strategy work, but also for fostering moral imagination. So helping teams to pick a preferred future, we want to work towards it, because like the more this preferred future actually moves to the middle, the more possible it's going to happen. So for us, it's really important to think about where we want to go, especially the ethical part, to go to a future that really helps us and the market here. And the future is a super broad field, and I think we heard a lot of really inspiring talks already tonight about different areas. And one area I want to focus on here is the area of extended realities, augmented realities. So the whole AR, VR market, because this will become massive in the next years. And we are defining the future we are heading to right now. And I think that's the reason why I brought up this, like the whole idea of futuring. So seeing the future as, as this map where we are heading to. So for everyone who's not super familiar with the terms I used, let's do a little refresher on that. So there is augmented reality, and I think, augmented reality is something we probably all have experienced or used already. So users see and interact with the real world while digital content is added to it. And if this sounds unclear to you, think about Pokemon Go, for example, where millions of people all over the world have been, using their smartphones and have gathered those like virtual creatures. I think it's a really vivid example of AR. Most of us have probably experienced that. And with virtual reality, it's a little bit different. You need to wear those special VR headsets to experience the virtual reality. And most of those VR headsets are connected to a computer, like an Oculus Rift or a gaming console, the PlayStation VR. But there are also standalone devices like the Google Cardboard, but most of them are in a combination with a phone. And then we have the extended and mixed reality areas, and there it really gets interesting because we can see, mixed realities start actually with the real world, and the virtual objects are not just like overlaid on the real world, but they can really interact with each other. And in this case, a user remains in the real world environment while digital content is added to it. So moreover, a user can interact with virtual objects. So there it really gets interesting also for us working in tech. And we can see mixed reality generally more or less advanced from AR. So let's look at a few examples. Augmented reality can help us to visualize certain information, for example, before purchasing it. So could be relevant information on a product or like a car windshield. Those areas we probably all have experienced at some point. There are also AR virtual features can add it to the real environment through some sort of devices like goggles or the smartphone. And the information generally often requires an actual location of the user. For example, when visiting some ruins, for example, one could see a visualization of what the place used to look like, for example. But This is not only useful for historical representation, but also for education purposes. And there it gets really interesting and is already used in different areas. So all the examples I just showed are actually visualized with the smartphones. But I think what's interesting for us to keep in mind that smartphones are just some kind of a transitional technology. So at some point when we have the right gadgets, talking about really AR goggles or even like smart contact lenses in the little bit far future, things are going to change there. And because that's really difficult for us to visualize, my experience there is that the area of speculative design is really helpful there because, talking about all those areas, especially when it comes to the future, where do we want to go, where's the preferred area of the future, what's possible, and what's more like speculative. The area of speculative design is really helpful here because it helps us to visualize the future we want to we want to get actually where we actually want to head to it. So that's usually really helpful. And the area of speculative design sees design as some kind of provocation. It helps us to really see how the future might look like in that area. And this is what's also really helpful for clients. So when I'm working with different clients, I am using this area of speculative design and helping them to visualize specific hypotheses they are having, which helps them in the end to test their ideas and their designs. So it's not only about really starting conversations, but it's more about defining the future we want to live in, and especially when it comes to immersive technologies in the early stages, define how we want to use it. And especially, when we are working on the future, right? So now is a really good time to start think about those areas and also to start discussions about the ethical part of those immersive technologies. And before I want to share a few action steps, which I experienced from my own work might be really helpful, I want to start with a few questions, which are usually really helpful to get started. So before we are diving deeper into the ethics and the ethical part, I want to share a few questions and a few areas that are interesting actually to have a closer look up and to start some discussions here. So the first question is around like public places. What does AR really mean for public places? So public places, we generally can differentiate our places in like public and private places, but it gets really interesting when those areas really interfere and you don't really know where it belongs to. So public places generally belong to all of us. They belong to the government, or they don't have a specific owner, I would say. So a public place is a location to which all of the public has access, and it's not a place exclusively used for like a private gathering or any other personal purposes, right? So formal public places are an important component in many areas, many neighborhoods. So they are places of discussion and exchange and ideas. So it's super important. And this is something we're probably all realizing, especially during COVID, when we are going outside and really meeting people and, sharing specific experiences, right? So when we are thinking about what defines those public places, we are thinking about monuments sometimes, or maybe also historical buildings. So what happens actually when firms upset the public, for example, by using brash augmentations on those monuments that can be considered at some point also as some kind of virtual graffiti if the augmentation isn't respectful or isn't appropriate, right? But who really defines what is respectful and what is appropriate? So how's the situation right now? Right now, AR is only accessible through your phone or also goggles if you already have them. But at some point, if we share one single networks for all the augmentation, it might be interesting what can be augmented and what can't. So there might be possibilities of veto against certain types of augmentation. So the question here is, if it's public, can we augment anything, anywhere? And also, are there exceptions? An augmentation could interfere with the intended use of a property, and this could have serious consequences in certain cases. So if we think about a hospital, for example, right, if we might wish to prevent unwanted augmentation from appearing in order to keep people from being distracted. Or if we think about a daycare center, for example, we might not wish to have graphic visualization of violence, for example, augmenting their place, as it might discourage parents to trust their bringing their children there. Also about art, especially when it comes to art, there's the question, should pieces of art experience the way they are? Perhaps a piece of art should be experienced the way it is and not through an augmentation, or also shouldn't be changed, or the augmentation shouldn't be added to this piece of art. So with the public places, we also have the private places. So what does extended realities really mean for private places? Especially is also the area in between when it comes to ownership. So when we are augmenting our own content and our private property or our home, we don't have any discussions about if we can do it or can't. But what happens when companies augment or grow, for example, a yard sign on a family private yard without asking? The law right now is not really defined there. And the question is it okay to augment public information on a private place or a private house? That's, I think, an interesting way to see that. And it seems that private owners could have rights over their virtual surroundings or their virtual property. But when we think about a website, for example, or an URL, who really owns that? It's some kind of a virtual property, and is it allowed to replace information there? You couldn't, for example, you couldn't really integrate your own newsletter on my personal website, right? So there are already some definitions there. So the question here is, how do we really define private? Where are any exceptions here? I'm thinking about, especially areas around like the states, when we, for example, when a road is closed and you need to have the sign like particularly on this specific property, although it's private property. And in this case, it might be subordinate of the greater good. And another question is also around like intellectual property, so which generally does not have a physical or virtual location, the same areas we're already working on right now. So how do we have to be, so we don't really have to be in a particular world or in a particular part of the world to experience some kind of a personal property. This really leads us to the next topic, which is around data. And one of the biggest questions here for sure is, how do we deal with these huge amount of data? There were already a lot of talks talking about the influences of AI and how to really use that in an ethical way. And we will have a similar discussion here around extended realities as well, because if we want to create those high visuals and also behavioral realistic augmentations, we need to gather a huge amount of data. And there is this term called superrealism, or and when we are creating this hypothetical superrealism, at some point it will be indistinguishable from reality. Experts call this superrealism. I think the word is a really great fit here. And you can enhance the superrealism also by collecting a lot of data from people, talking about the location, body movement, different preferences, but also actions or things they're doing in their virtual or semi-virtual environment. And this, for sure, is going to lead an increase of personal data acquisition, better articulate movements or personalized advertisement, or also like specific features relevant to geographical locations. Imagine sitting in a train right now, and the person in front of you can recognize you, although you have never met, and can see your LinkedIn profile, can find the videos you just uploaded on TikTok, the article you published a few years ago on Medium. and maybe also find information about your current job status. That might be kind of dystopian, right? And this is something where I have seen a few tendencies at specific platforms, and definitely a really important point to talk about when it comes to data and extended realities, right? Because like besides the creation of realistic virtual world, another very important question to ask is about the boundaries of anonymity. And one of the biggest challenges and concerns, I think, generally is about face recognition. And there are already a few interesting websites out there using those face recognitions. One, for example, is Blip AR. They're using that a little bit more around for celebrities, but generally they're using face recognition with AR and visual search technologies. And at the moment, it more or less encourages to look up gossip from celebrity, but you could also, like, if you are cross-referencing that with other networks, for example, you could totally blow people's anonymity in public places. And I think that's something we definitely don't want to happen. And this leads us to the next topic, which is a little bit about like misuse. You know, personal data acquisition, it's not only misusing them in case of face recognition, but also on sharing with third-party companies. That's an important topic too, which really deserves attention. And besides using the data for personal ads or like tricking the user into doing things that are maybe even harmful for him, it's also either sharing that with third-person or third-party companies, or that those third-party companies hack these data and then misuse them in the way that we don't want that to happen. For example, using someone's weak spots for personalized ad targeting. And the huge amount of data really leads us in the next topic, which is around real and fake, which opens up a lot of questions. So how do we see and behave in a world or in an augmented world where you have maybe difficulties to differentiate between real and fake? And another question is, will this even be a question? So I already talked about the word superrealism, which I already talked about. That stands for a super high level of behavioral realism of visual objects and humans, which will become increasingly likely and available in the near future. And this huge amount of realism of digital objects brings up a lot of interesting questions, I think. And I'm talking about like mapping and analyzing every movement, as well as features and mimic and the way people really speak and behave, help the service in the end to create an even more realistic virtual world. And a few problems we're having right now combined with the extended reality area, because gathering a lot of data and might inspire making some kind of virtual copies of people that look and act like a real person. So I'm thinking here about like fake news or also deliberate mistaken identities, and maybe even like body swapping, things we are experiencing already right now with all the advancements of AI. This leads us to the topic of deepfake. I guess most of you have probably heard about the problem or the incident a few weeks ago. So an AI tool was actually programmed to remove items of clothes from photos that targeted more than 1,000 women, some whom even be under the age of 18. And the service was operating primarily on the encrypted messaging app Telegram using an AI-powered bot. And it worked like that users could send an image of a woman they wanted to see naked to the bot, and the bot would then strip naked the image, generating a fake nude body and superimpose it to the original image of the woman they send it to. So most of the original images appeared to be taken from like social media or different social networks. And the women most of the times didn't really know that this even happened. This is just a super small example, but the more data you have and the more realistic you can have that, especially if you gather three-dimensional data and all those in all those areas, it's more easy to create those deepfake videos and areas. So there are a lot of interesting reports around that topic. One is from Sensity. I think this was a really interesting one because they did a huge report on that, and they released that last year. And like their result was actually that an overwhelmingly percentage of all the deep fakes online are used to harass, humiliate, and even extort women. So they've reported last year that 96% of deepfake videos online were non-consensual pornography. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind, and opens up the question of what is real, what is fake. It will be more difficult to really differentiate between areas that are real and that are fake, also about content that is real and that is fake. And this leads us to the question number 5, which is around confusion. So how to create the least confusion and how to really guide the user and help them understand what is real, what is fake, how to use the data in an ethical way, and to create the least confusion generally. Because like the more you guide the user in the end, the bigger is also your responsibility. And when we are thinking about like successful AR applications, like, you know, I just mentioned Pokemon Go, they didn't do that right in the beginning, right? Because there's online still a Pokemon Go death player, which counts death of Pokemon Go player. And most of those deaths are actually caused by people walking on the street or going in dangerous areas. So they were guided through specific areas, but in the end, it's important for us designing those products to really understand the environment there, that where we are augmenting. And if we are leading users in dangerous areas or onto roads or onto trains that might be unsafe, warning and trying to cause the less confusion there and really guiding the user there. So the goal would be like to create the least psychological harm. And this is the second part of the confusion area that really represents situations that might cause psychological harm, such as representation of specific areas where it's really difficult to differentiate between what is real and what is fake. There are a lot of studies, and there are definitely warning there. So I want to finish this question area with even more questions, because I think what's interesting here is also, are there any exceptions about like, what should be able to augment? You know, when we are thinking about the internet right now, there are a lot of things most people don't really see, talking about like super adult content or even like extreme religious views. There are most of the times outside the direct concern of the general public, but that might change as soon as the area of augmentation really moves into the in the main area. Because when we share one single platform, it might be a little bit more difficult to hide those kind of content. Same with really who should be able to augment. Are there any vetoes, and also where? Are there any restrictions, or how do we really open up with some kind of a conduct here? So a lot of questions, and the ethical part there probably really helps us to find a few solutions there and to come up with a few action steps here. Because like in the scientific context, the use of extended reality or extended technology is usually controlled by some wide guidelines and laws that vary across countries, but there are some general principles. I'm thinking about like the respect of autonomy, dignity of persons, scientific value, but also social responsibility, minimizing benefits, and those kind of areas. And I want to share a few action steps which might be helpful to keep in mind when we are starting to design for those areas. The first is minimizing harm. Generally, there is a huge difference between people spending 2 hours a week in a virtual or augmented reality than spending 8 hours a day in the same environment. It's always about the regulation of specific areas or specific products. There are even studies that moderate social media use is not harmful or might even be beneficial. I'm talking about the Weinstein studies from 2017 here. So a social normal might be helpful here. So we usually don't allow providers to supply a potential harmful product and then dissolves all the risk to the user. We are usually regulating the supply of a product and service to, which really helps the user in the end to ensure that they use it appropriately. And when we're thinking about even like addictive supplies like alcohol or tobacco, it's very similar. So maybe in the end, these essential, or that helps us in the end, to think about the consequences when we are designing those for those areas, and also think about ways how we can really prevent the danger of those areas where we don't really know how this might be harmful for people in the end. And besides minimizing harm, it's also about minimizing risk. So the second step is very much about like minimizing risk. And how could that look like? What could that actually mean? In the end, it could be, it's about how these specific actions are seen in the virtual world. So starting actually really by considering what kind of actions are made possible within extended realities and how these actions are represented and where actions are encouraged or also discouraged. Thinking about, for example, games or gaming, right? So if people get killed there, is that discouraged, or so do you get rewards or do you get punished? And how do you really guide the user there to really help them understand what is appropriate and what isn't? I'm thinking here about like some kind of ethical code of conduct here. It's about the content here. So really think about what is the content here and how do you guide the user here to really provide the best experience in the end. Another area I think would be really interesting to consider is the realness. So most of the questions I just talked about are about the differentiation between real and fake, differentiating between that, and also making sure that you are able to see the difference between the real world and also all the areas and the digital virtual objects that are just like overlaid your world. And an idea there could be selecting some kind of levels of deception. That could look, that you have specific rating systems so that you as a person, if you are using a specific virtual object, could decide between the level of deceptions. When we have 10 levels, level 10 would be to completely convince the user of the realness, that it's 100% real, and level 1 would be a constant reminder that the world is not real. For example, with a specific halo in the sound, or that characters might look different. So a simple alternative to selecting the levels of deception within an XR application. That wouldn't be super easy in the beginning to implement, but what could be a starting point there is also to think about some kind of a rating system you integrate as a developer, and to say like the same when I'm thinking about like games or movies, some kind of a rating system. So the user could decide, okay, it's level 10, it's the realness is a little bit too high for me. I'd rather use an application which is level 3, for example. And that really leads us to the next topic, which is about education, all about education here, especially at that point. this should be always a principal goal for developers or people working in tech or using those technologies, so really understanding the whole concept. And I really like to use medicine as an example there, right? Because if you are sick, if you take a drug, then you use that, of course, for the positive aspect. So you know about the negative side effects too, but you take that for the positive effects, right? So when you share a product or an extended reality prototype or design, you share the positive effects, but you also warn about the side effects. And I think that's a really important thing there, educating, but also sharing the knowledge and the information so that the user really learns those areas. And education, there are a lot of examples, I think also in the past, where this area was a little bit not 100% in the user's need, I would say. And one example that I really find super interesting is the advertisement in the cinemas or in movies in the 1950s, where there was this like super short advertisement. So the ads were just shown like super quickly, so that the brain saw it, but you couldn't really like recognize it. And after this was discovered, it got banned, right? But don't do things like that, but be really open about the things and know how you really influence the user at all the specific touch points there. And I think one of the most important things here, a lot of other talks already talked about the area, how to integrate AI and how to really use those personal informations and how to really protect the user here. Data issues should be addressed here super carefully and should be discussed also in a team when you're starting with those products. We have in the end a responsibility to really use that appropriately, right? And to come back to the beginning, when we are talking about the future and the term of future ring, we are defining if the preferred futures are a little bit more outside, so not that possible, or if they're moving to the middle so that they're more probable. Because the most horrible future for us would be to define a preferred future, and that is so far off our reach that this won't happen anymore. And we are defining that right now. The importance of AR is so interesting right now, because when we are thinking about how we are using the web or how we're using technology, it has changed so much the last 20 years. This will change even more the next 20 or 30, 50 years. And the interesting thing about the web is that we are only experiencing the web when we are opening our smartphones, when we are looking on our watch. But the real virtual objects are more and more melting together in the end. And I really like this quote from Scott Belsky, which underlines how big the extended reality market is going to get the next years, and also about the potential here. So to sum that a little bit up, the development of increasingly virtual world allows for a lot of advancements in XR technology to be used in so many areas, right? Like the examples we talked about in the beginning, the areas of like training and education and psychotherapy, physical, medical rehabilitation, also marketing, entertainment, education, further application and research, so many things. But with all the benefits comes a lot of potential misuse, abuse, neglect, and for us, it's really important to think about like the ethical part there and really address the ethical concerns there. And it's not only about like human-centered design and thinking about empathy, so what's harmful to you, do not do to others, but really thinking about a code of conduct. So how to implement that in your team. And the challenge for us as designers or as people working in those areas is now to really determine what should be in this code of conduct. So how to really come to the preferred future and really push that in the middle so that it's it's possible because now we are in the very early stages of those technologies and really define the way how we behave and how we really deal with that. So I want to say, let me know if you are working in those areas, if you want to chat or to connect. I'm super happy to share a lot of more information, or I'm also really happy to connect. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. And yeah, please say hi. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and yeah, thank you so much for being here. I think, yeah, there are a lot of interesting and super helpful discussions for all of us. And yeah, say hi at LinkedIn or Twitter. And I wish you all a lot of fun with the other sessions here. And yeah, have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.